Welcome to Launch One with Mason Springer. I'm Mason Springer, and today we're joined by Christian Williams. Christian is the founder and operator of Archery Strong, which is kind of like I guess, a coaching program. I know you guys have been helping me out a lot over the last couple months here, and that's kind of the main reason why I wanted to have you on, is talk a little bit of Archery Strong going into bow season, and just kind of talk about how it's helped me. And honestly, Christian, I think that it is a part of the game that is like mostly untapped in the target side of things, and I think it can definitely show some big benefits to a lot of archers. But yeah, so thanks for coming on today.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm looking forward to talking with you. We've had a couple of good conversations on the phone up to this point, and then, of course, going back and forth regarding training. So this will be a nice opportunity to have more of an informal conversation, and I'm sure we'll get into some good topics and hopefully give the listeners some good information and maybe something enjoyable to listen to as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So I kind of first ran into some of your social media contents probably in a few years now, and I remember every time I came across one of your videos, like where you were showing different exercises and stuff for archery, I'd always like save it in my phone, that way I could go back and look at it.
Sure.
And so I was keeping updated on your stuff for a couple years, and finally a couple months ago I reached out. We had a phone call, had a great call. I'm like, yeah, I gotta hook up with Christian. So since then, I've been doing some Archery Strong stuff just about every day. Is about where my schedule's at with that. But I just love the fact that I kind of came to you and said, hey, this time of the year, I'm shooting target archery. I'm looking to like increase performance. Worked on a lot of core stuff for shooting in the wind. And then overall strength training for archery, which you're an expert on, and you can talk about that a lot better than I can. But you outlined a great plan for me to work through that part of the season, and ended up showing some really good results for me in the competition side of things.
Yeah, it's I think been really good so far, and we are covering a lot of bases, like you said, where you're somebody that can push a little bit deeper, a little bit more broad into training, in the sense of I offer a lot of different types of training for different archers, and the goal is to find that right fit for each individual, right? So some people are just dipping their toes in the water, just starting to do some of the physical training, and they're more on that like beginner, lighter side of training. We have some people in the middle, and then we've got people like yourself, where I would say you're, again, in more of an in-depth focus for training, a broader focus for training. And I think it's been going well so far. And essentially, with what I do for Archery Strong, I call it a three-headed monster, so to speak, in the sense that I do work with people and archers to help relieve pain, help fix and prevent injury, and then to improve performance. And I like what you said earlier, where you had mentioned that the physical training side for archers is largely untapped. And I would say it hasn't really caught up, in the sense that it has caught up for a lot of other sports, where if you look at, everything from baseball players to golfers, basketball players, all these different sports, the vast majority of the higher level competitors are doing training outside of their sport to then support them within the sport. And like you said, that really hasn't been tapped all that much and hasn't really caught up for archers. And there's huge potential. And I've seen that from everybody from the bowhunter to the weekend warrior to the high level competitor to the individual who likes to shoot local tournaments, everybody in between, where when we can address as I like to call it, the machine behind the bow, meaning when we can train and work on and improve the archer's physical ability to then use and operate that bow each and every shot, there's so much potential to tap into when it comes to strength, stability, control of their movements and positions within the shot, delaying fatigue and improving stamina. There's just so much of the physical side that most archers know is important. They feel it's important in their shooting. It either is something that limits them, or maybe it's a strong area for them. But many archers don't take that next step to say, okay, what can I do to improve how I feel, to improve my physical performance, to improve my confidence physically, and get into those either training programs or the type of training or training schedule, something that's going to uplift them. So that's where, we've jumped into, and definitely pays off in a lot of different ways, depending on what that archer's looking for.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think that, well, like we talked about earlier, it's so much, I think it's untapped, like I said before, but as far as like bow hunting, target archery, it all comes into play. And I think like a lot of people look at archery as, a lot of people would not consider it a sport, and whether it is or not is pretty debatable. But I think that almost definitely it is something where having physical health, physical ability is definitely beneficial. So let's talk about that. Like, what actually makes archery a sport where you need to do some strength training, you need to do this and that?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question, because to start the answer to that, I'd boil it down to the very simple fact that at an absolute foundational level, at the very base level of archery, is the fact that archery is a repetitive motion and a repetitive loading sport, or let's just say activity. And I'm going to say that again because those two keys are, again, at the foundation. Archery is a repetitive motion and a repetitive load activity. And if we break that down, repetitive motion means that to pick up a bow and participate in archery, where we're raising the bow, drawing the bow, holding at full draw, and then executing a shot, that's repetitive motion. It takes motion each and every time to perform that activity, to shoot a bow. That motion is fueled and made possible by our body. Our nervous system communicates with our musculature and our muscles and connective tissue then allow us to move joints and bones that, as a result, move that bow. So there's motion occurring each and every time there, and that boils down to the demand on the body to perform that motion, which takes physical precision, takes physical strength, takes endurance. And then it's a repetitive load activity, meaning that most archers understand and know very simply that they're drawing weight, right? We talk about draw weight in archery. We talk about mass weight of the bow. We talk about the holding weight we have for a compound bow. They know that they're working with weight, but they don't make the connection between, on a simple level, it is almost the same to say that every time we draw, let's say, a 50-pound bow is almost the same as pulling a 50-pound band or lifting a 50-pound weight, rowing a 50-pound weight, or pulling 50 pounds on a cable machine. The body doesn't really know the difference. There's some slight differences between the type of loading between a bow and a band and a weight and a cable machine and whatnot. But the point being is it's all load. Load meaning its resistance is maybe a more relatable term, where there's resistance from that bow, there's resistance from a weight in the gym, there's resistance from a band, in your basement, whatever it might be. And each time we are working against that resistance of the bow, that requires muscular strength, stability, stamina, and those all boil down to the physical attributes that the body either can or cannot efficiently reproduce each and every shot. So the question then becomes, okay, we know that we've got to create motion via our body to draw and shoot that bow. We've got to be able to tolerate and move against the resistance of the bow each and every shot. So does the body have the physical capacity not just to shoot the bow, because on a base level that's pretty manageable for most people, but to do it well, to do it with minimal fatigue, to do it without feeling tired, to do it without losing stability and feeling stable and keeping pin float minimal, and ultimately to be physically proficient when we are repeating that motion and repeatedly encountering that resistance of a bow. So, as you said earlier, a lot of people don't look at archery as a sport, and I would add to that and say a lot of people don't look at archers and think about them like athletes. And part of that's because we're not running, we're not jumping, we're not throwing, we're not being explosive. But I would also say that's the case for a golfer, right? And some other sports as well, where you might not have the traditional physical display of an athlete like running, jumping, throwing, lifting, etc. But the concept remains the same, where we're still performing a precise physical activity, we're doing it against resistance, we're doing it repeatedly. And although it might not require the explosiveness of a shot put thrower or the pure strength of an Olympic weightlifter, we still are, in our own way, participating in those physical challenges, so to speak, that just look a little bit different. And again, all of that boils down to the body needing to perform that physical task, and is the body up to performing that task. And I think that really encompasses the idea of archery being a sport, archers being athletes. And I would say, though, on the same note, that there's a lot of room to grow there. Just like we said earlier, that this is an area that's often untapped. And I would even go a step further to say, because I think it's important, that it's also the area a lot of times that takes the most work, and sometimes is not the most enjoyable to some people. What I mean by that is most archers would rather mess with the tune of their bow, or would rather tinker with their arrow setup, which is important, no doubt about it. But that's a lot of times easier and takes less physical grit and effort than training, getting stronger, more fit, whatever it might be. Or, they want to just shoot more arrows and continue to work on their form, because that's a little bit more fun than, working in a weight room or putting a pack on and getting more steps in, a little bit more cardiovascular endurance, just for a broader, better foundation of physical health and ability. So it often gets pushed, I would say, to the side, pushed on the back burner, because it takes work, takes effort. And I also like to include in these conversations, Mason, that I have never said, and I never will say, that somebody has to train themselves physically to be a great archer, because it's just not the case. There's many good archers out there that don't do anything for physical training, and you can, again, become a great archer that way. But the question I normally follow with is, what are you leaving on the table? Could you be even better? Could you even get more out of archery? Could you add that 5-10% that you've been working so hard for and really pushing for as far as improvement as an archer? And that's what it boils down to, where this is not a necessity, and I will never say it's a necessity, but do I think it can help the vast majority of archers, bow hunters, etc.? Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. And I think that, with there's a couple ways. So you talked about how, it's a repetitive load resistance, like, you're pulling against the bow. But you're also, once you get to full draw, staying static and staying still and trying to stay as still as possible, which is one of the things that kind of makes shooting sports a lot more unique, as compared to other sports. And I think that what a lot of people would care about most when it comes to their physical ability is how steady they can hold. I've heard plenty of guys that, maybe they're going into the senior class and, I can't hold as good as I used to. That keys in my head that, physical, ability does have something to do with how steady you can hold.
Absolutely.
So talk about how physical training can help you hold steadier.
Yeah, it's a great question. And that's a big part of what I focus on, I would say, with most of my archers, but it's of course a top priority for competitive archers, tournament archers that I work with. And let's get probably the well-known piece out of the way. And that is, of course, we can manipulate, adjust, and set up our bow and our equipment to help improve steadiness. If you take two different bows, one is going to be can be optimized for holding more steady than the other. Of course, that comes down to stabilizer weight, distribution there, and the different things we can, again, manipulate and set up on that bow. So that's an important piece, and that can be very helpful. But that bow doesn't hold itself, right? Even with the most perfectly balanced and set up stabilizers and whatnot on that bow still can't hold itself steady. It's just going to sit on the table. It's going to, hang from a hook, whatever it might be. So ultimately, it's the archer that's drawing and then holding that bow, and we're trying to minimize pin float and minimize the movement of the bow as much as possible. So the question, as you asked, is how can physical training help improve that? So at a foundational level, when we're talking about this concept of holding a bow steady, what we're ultimately looking for is we are trying to get the musculature of the body to hold in a constant static, is the word you use, which is a great word, constant static state. And what I mean by that is, as we talked about earlier, the body is just a pile of bone and tissue unless we can get that tissue, the muscle, let's say, we can get that muscle to move and hold the bones in place. And that's what's holding your body and holding the bow in place is muscle and bone. Now, as we branch off of that, muscle is just a hunk of flesh. It's just a hunk of meat, unless we have the nervous system that tells the muscle what to do. So this is where we really get to the answer and get down into the specifics. The nervous system, your nerves, most people have heard of your nerves, travel from your spinal cord, spinal column, and your brain out into your muscles. That nervous system is like the wiring in a house. It communicates signals with the muscle tissue, and that nervous system is what tells the muscle what to do. So we're going farther down this path. With training, what we're ultimately trying to do, and some of this occurs in archery too, it's just limited to the one movement of shooting. But with training, we're focusing on a variety of different movements, loads, types of muscle contractions, different demands on the nervous system to ultimately train that nervous system to more efficiently, effectively, precisely, and accurately communicate with the muscles to hold in that steady, constant, static state as best as possible. Because what's happening when somebody moves too much during their aim, or they feel shaky, or they feel like their aim is wavering up, down, side to side, what's happening there is the muscles are contracting, slightly relaxing, contracting, slightly relaxing. I like to, I don't think most people are going to be able to see us, so I'll describe it that I like to think about this as like a rubber band. Okay, if you pull a rubber band to tension, when you're moving and shaking during aiming more than you'd like, that rubber band is contracting, stretching, contracting, stretching, contracting, stretching on a small amount, but it's causing that unwanted movement. What we want to be able to do is hold that rubber band at a constant length, down to the millimeter, as precisely as possible, so there's not that constant contract, relax. And that's what that shaking is the muscles are not able to hold that constant, steady, static state. More movement comes on than what we would like. Through training, we train that nervous system again to be more efficient, precise, accurate with communicating to the muscle, and then the muscle's physical, mechanical ability to hold in that state against load, under fatigue, after many, many repetitions. And we are basically training that precision to be able to remain in that constant, steady, solid state. So that we don't have the unwanted movement, so that we don't have as much variation in those muscles and in those joints that's causing us to not hold almost like, a statue, a stone. Now, it's very important for me to say that it is not possible to 100% eliminate movement. We are not after bringing movement down to a zero. We're trying to shrink and minimize movement as much as possible. And that's where we go from, let's say that pin's moving around in a couple of inches. It's moving, side to side, up and down a couple of inches, to shrinking it down to, centimeters or millimeters, where we're as confined as possible, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And you said something about training the nervous system. I know that
Yes.
when I first started doing Archery Strong, like after I really wasn't expecting like a really noticeable change very quickly. I expected it to be maybe a change over a month, 2 months, something like that.
Right.
But I remember after the first week of doing Archery Strong, maybe the first 5 days even, shooting my bow felt totally different. Like you talk about training the nervous system, and I asked you, I said, I don't know if it's like placebo or what, but
Right.
I feel like I'm shooting my bow better after doing this for just a few days. And I remember you had said that that could be that my nervous system was trained a little bit differently, more efficiently. So talk
Yes.
about that. Is that something that's common amongst people
Yeah.
you work with?
Yeah, you made a great observation with that because, as you had said, you had noted that hey, Marty's feeling some differences. Is that just my imagination, or what is that? And I think my response was something along the lines of, it is the nervous system already adapting, and the reason for that is the nervous system is very very adaptable, very there's a word that sometimes used, plastic. The nervous system has great plasticity, meaning that it can adapt, it can learn, it can improve very quickly. Whereas in the research is very clear on that in many, many different realms, and I'll give you a couple examples here in a minute. Whereas the muscle does take much longer. Muscles, we don't start to see change in muscle, whether that's endurance, strength, etc. We don't really start to see change until at least a couple of weeks, more like a month or two. However, that nervous system, we can get some adaptation and some improvement quite quickly. And the way to think about this is, if you've ever tried a new skill or a new task, it could be playing an instrument, it could be working and doing something with your hands, it could be something artistic. These kind of fine motor skills, they are highly dependent on your nervous system. And you can, let's say, I'm not musical at all, but I could go and take a 1 hour lesson for some sort of instrument I've never really played, and the difference is going to be quite good from beginning to end. Now, some of that comes from knowledge and different things like that, but part of it is your nervous system is very quickly adapting and learning to the new stimulus or the new challenge that you're placing on it. And again, it can learn very quickly. And the same thing occurs with training. So when we're working on some of these aspects in training related to the nervous system, which is a big part of what we're training. We're not just training muscle, but nervous system is a big part of it. We're working with things like, I'll call it tempo work, where we're moving very slowly in a certain movement for a specified amount of time. We might be training holding in certain positions with different types of loads so that we're statically holding against resistance. We might be emphasizing a very specific part of a range of motion that we're really hammering to drive home control and stability in that specific range of motion. And what we're doing in those instances is we're placing a demand on the nervous system and basically requiring it to hold as stable as possible with time under tension, or move as slow and controlled as possible through a specific range of motion or position. And when we highlight those movements, positions, etc., with those demands, that's where the nervous system essentially has to rise to the occasion. It has to step up to the plate and take on the challenge. And all the nervous system knows is, hey, I'm being challenged right now. I have to adapt to this and figure out how to do this. And that's where those changes and improvements come in, where we now are training that nervous system to be more stable, to be more efficient, to be able to hold more solid, move with more control, and ultimately be able to manage the amount of force it's producing. Because with something like aiming and holding steady, what we're doing is we're applying force in different directions, trying to solidify that hold before we execute our shot. We're pushing up on the bow to keep keep it up, right? Otherwise, gravity is going to pull it down. So how precisely can I exert that force up on the bow so that I'm not going up, down, up, down, up, down on the target? We're pulling against that back wall. How consistently can I pull against that wall? Or maybe you're somebody who's trying to gradually increase your tension until that shot breaks. How gradually and incrementally and linearly can I increase that tension on the back wall? How precise can I keep that pressure on my grip on my bow? How well can I exert force gently against wind that's trying to blow me left or right on the target? So there's all these little pieces where we're exerting force in full draw, and it comes down to the nervous system communicating with the musculature to be able to manage that force that we are applying in those different directions and in those different ways in the shot, so that ultimately we can be as controlled and precise as possible.
Yeah, wow. So I look at some of these elite recurve archers from like Turkey or Brazil, and those guys do not have a lot of muscle mass, but I know that they train a lot physically for archery. So are they training a lot of their nervous system for archery over muscle?
Yeah. So there's some different ways that we can approach training that are going to be either more focused on those producing those nervous system improvements, or just take bodybuilding, for instance. We're solely focused on overloading the muscle tissue to force muscle tissue growth there. And there's certainly differences between the two. So you essentially are getting at a good point here, where our training, unless the individual wants it as a byproduct, wants muscle growth as a byproduct, when I'm training archers, I'm really not focused at all on producing muscle mass. I'm focused on, again, those nervous system adaptations, improving movement patterns, and increasing stability, and those different effects we talked about for minimizing movement. We're focused on being able to find, create, and solidify positions, increasing strength when it comes to draw strength or strength of the bow holding arm and shoulder. Muscle is not the goal here. Muscle for the archer is I'll say not necessarily important, because by nature, having some muscle mass has some good effects just overall in general. But when we're talking about performance, we're not saying, hey, we need to increase the size of your deltoids, or we need to build the size of your lats. That's not at all the focus, because that's not what's going to be fruitful for the archer when we're looking at trying to improve these physical attributes of strength, stamina, stability, control, mobility, flexibility as well of the upper body. So yes, there's a difference there, and you're observing that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And that kind of leads me to a funny thing that I've noticed over the last couple of years of going to Total Archery Challenge. Tack shoots probably have the largest concentration of big muscles, but they also have the worst like accuracy, if that makes sense. Like,
oh yeah.
And I don't know if that's just a chance correlation, but that's just one thing that I noticed. I thought was kind of funny.
Yeah. The first thing I would say is that muscle mass in no way, shape, or form makes somebody a good archer. So that's for sure. The other piece is that a lot of time, or sometimes, archers will kind of over rely on the fact that they are indeed strong, and I think that will carry them through or really add to their proficiency, where it just doesn't. There's obviously way more factors involved in just being strong. Where strong is good, but there's a simple quote I like that big doesn't equal strong. Strong is strong, meaning that just because somebody is big doesn't always mean they're strong in the ways that are going to be beneficial. And we don't necessarily need to be big to be strong. We can be strong by just developing strength and not necessarily worrying about muscle mass. So there's a lot of things going on there for sure. But I think the take-home point there is muscle mass is not going to make you a good shooter. It does not mean you're a good shooter, and there's some evidence for that.
Yeah, absolutely. That makes sense. So going into bow season here, I know one thing that I've kind of always been, I've always thought about, hunting with compound bow is I shoot 70 pounds for indoor season, which is a lot. Like I'll stand up there and shoot 60 arrows at 70 pounds, no problem. But when I'm hunting, I turn my bow down to 65 pounds just because I've always been afraid that, some cold December morning when I'm wearing these big heavy clothes, I'm going to go to draw back on this deer and I'm not going to be able to get the bow back.
Yeah.
And, I can do it in the yard every time. But that's one thing I've always been worried about. So this year, now that I'm working with you, I'm going to have a lot more confidence that I can pull back that 70 pounds, no problem, on a cold winter morning, something like that. But what's one way that I can ensure that that's not going to be an issue? Is there warm-ups or something I can do, like before I go to the stand or something like that?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I would give a couple of thoughts give you a couple of thoughts in response to that question. So first and foremost is I think I posted a YouTube video a couple weeks ago where my encouragement or my recommendation is to choose your draw weight on what is manageable and effective for you in the worst possible conditions or scenario. And what I mean by that is when it's 70 degrees and you're in your backyard in a t-shirt and shorts and you're on level ground and you've been moving around and feeling good, a certain draw weight, let's just say 75 pounds, might feel just fine, perfectly feasible. But you laid it out very well there, Mason, in the sense that when we're in the field and we're bow hunting, there are a variety of factors that are going to make that draw harder and going to make you feel weaker. And that can be everything from cold temperatures is a big one. Heavy, bulky clothing is a big one. A long time being sedentary, if you're doing an all-day sit during the rut, or even just a couple of hours of trying to stay as motionless as possible, being sedentary for a while is a big one. Just like when you get out of the car after a road trip and you're like, man, I feel stiff and I feel like I'm not at my top physical shape by any means. So that's a big one. Another one is awkward positions or unstable footing. I think for the past 3 years, I've taken shots successfully, but I've taken shots every season for the past 3 years that were very, very awkward to draw in. The couple that come to mind were shooting on that weak side in a saddle, and situations like that where your footing might not be ideal, or maybe you're having to rotate your torso farther than you normally would. So point being is there's a lot of things in the field that are going to make drawing that bow harder and going to make you feel weaker. So if you choose that draw weight based on what's manageable, or maybe just manageable in the backyard in warm weather, minimal clothing, good footing, etc., and you encounter those harder factors in the field, you may run into problems. So I too, in the past couple of years, I've lowered my draw weight a couple of pounds at least, just with that acknowledgement. Another good example of this is I personally do a lot of hunting on the ground for whitetails, and I've had in the past couple of years, I had a spot and stalk on a whitetail that I shoot from a kneeling position, different from standing, not quite as strong. I've had a number of seated shots on whitetails, sitting behind a fallen log or tucked into some brush, things like that. Not going to be quite as strong. So I think the most important thing is just making sure that draw weight is manageable, not just in your backyard, but in the least ideal conditions. Beyond that, you had mentioned a warm up and things of that sort. The fact of the matter is once we're in the tree, there's not a whole lot we can do because we don't want to move very much. Now, warm up beforehand, it could be useful, but once you've been seated for an hour or two, couple of hours, really any benefit from that warm up is going to have worn off. So I don't see it being all that productive. I've put a video out before where some simple things that simple things that you can do that are not ideal or of the highest quality, but they're able to satisfy, hey, can I get a little bit of movement or warm up without causing a lot of movement in the tree stand? And one of them was, and again, I don't think people can see us, but if you're in your saddle or seated in your stand or just standing on your platform, whatever it might be, it's just some simple rotation of your arms with your hands by your side. So you're basically just turning your hands clockwise, rotating your whole arm. You can do it really nice and slow, so it's not a bother or not alarming as far as movement goes. Just to get some rotation in that shoulder joint is something. It's the idea that something's better than nothing. So that's one. Can also do a variety of isometrics where I've put my hands in my pockets before and kind of push into your legs, pull out against your pockets, push your hands together, pull away from your legs. So you're just, by doing those isometrics and applying pressure in different directions, you're getting those muscles working in some capacity. And then the last one was interlocking your fingers, kind of like in like a prayer position, and same idea, pulling your hands apart, pushing your hands together, pressing in different directions. You're getting the nervous system firing. You're getting those the musculature to produce some force. Again, not ideal or perfect by any means, but it's something is better than nothing. And this type of stuff is particularly helpful for a lot of times like older archers who just want to be able to do something while they're on stand and feeling tight, feeling stiff, feeling a little bit weak from sitting around quite a bit, and maybe even cold too.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I'm gonna have to do that this fall. I think that, yeah, that's one thing. You talk about after a long car ride, like standing up, you just feel stiff. It's it's the same way after you've been sitting in the stand all day. But yeah, I know. And some of like the hang-ons that I've hunted on, like I'll alternate, once every hour or so from sitting to standing, and just trying to, get a little bit of change in, because I feel like sitting all day is not a good idea, and probably standing all day would not be good either. But again, you talk about, you don't want to move a whole lot when you're up in the tree hunting either. So it's kind of a trade-off there. But
yeah, it's tricky.
I think there's plenty to do. But so let's see. Let me look at the date here. So it's Wednesday, July 29th, as we're recording this. And I think that people are just now like, I know a lot of the guys that are really into have been shooting their bows for a long time, but a lot of the weekend warriors, I feel like, are just starting to break out the bows. And what's one thing that a guy like that can do to get into his training season, shooting that bow again, building up that strength for bow season, and making sure that when the time comes, he can figure out what draw weight he can pull back in that crazy situation. Like how can someone replicate that crazy situation to find out like where they should set their draw weight?
Yeah, that's a great question. So focusing in on that first, and then I'll touch on a couple of other things that I think tie into this. But the question is essentially, how do we figure out or find that draw weight that's going to be ideal in that situation? Off the top of my head, I don't think there's a way you can replicate that situation, because I don't think anybody's going to, sit around for a couple of hours in heavy clothing and be still and then all of a sudden stand up and shoot their bow. I think my best advice there would come more from the side of being honest with oneself, meaning that when you're shooting in your backyard, there really should be very minimal struggle or strain with that draw. It should be something that's smooth, something that's confident, something that you feel capable with. And I would say, since we can't replicate the exact conditions of being out, hunting for a period of time with these different limiting factors, I would say that your first draw is often a good indicator of truly what you feel with that draw when you go to shoot with minimal warm up beforehand, or the idea being that you haven't gone through a dozen or a couple dozen arrows to kind of get in that groove that you feel once you start a practice session, but rather like I'll pull my bow off the hook in my basement, walk out behind my barn onto my range, and that first draw, what does that feel like? Is it confident? Do you feel capable? Is it smooth? Do you feel strong? Those questions, and I'll go through those again, if you answer them honestly, will lead you to say, you know what, there is some struggle. My draw feels a little bit sticky on those first couple. I'm not 100% confident with it. Where again, those questions are that your draw should feel comfortable, shouldn't be, grinding or you're really straining fighting through it. It should be comfortable. You should feel capable with it. You should feel confident with it. You should feel smooth with your draw, and you should feel strong with your draw. Most of the time, I would say, when I am particularly working with bow hunters, I would say that more often than not, bow hunters would do themselves a good service of decreasing by a few pounds, where I find it less common for me to say, hey, you're drawing that like a breeze. You could add a few pounds here. That happens sometimes, but again, it's more often that I don't think it's any secret that the ego is involved with us bow hunters, and I've been there before too. I've had an ego check as well with both a compound and a traditional bow, where most of the time, most of us are leaning towards being a little bit too heavy rather than being a little bit too light. Now, you had mentioned specifically, or you had framed this question specifically around that weekend warrior. So a couple of things I wanted to add, just because I think they're helpful. First and foremost, if somebody has not shot their bow maybe since the last archery season, or maybe you've shot it here and there in the past couple of months, but you want to get consistent, here would be, I'll see if I can keep them in mind, 4 things that I would share. First and most important is ease back in. I get probably a dozen people every year that come to me that want to work on pain or an injury or a problem because they finally decided to pick up their bow. They get excited about it, which is great, but then they go and shoot 50 or 100 arrows in their shoulders, their elbows, etc. Haven't seen that specific load and movement for 6 months, and boom, you get this big spike of arrow volume. It causes an acute overload on some of these structures. Problem occurs, and now we've got to resolve it before archery season. So ease back in. Start with a half a dozen arrows. Grab your bow, shoot a half dozen. Cool. Good to go. Next session, maybe add 3, shoot 9. Next session, maybe add 3, shoot 12. Just ease back in. If you don't do that, you may be just fine, and even likely be just fine. But I see a lot of issues show up from that, so I always like to put that out. That's number 1. Number 2 is to remove the barrier to consistent practice. And what I mean by that is a lot of people want to start shooting their bow again or want to shoot more consistently, but they've got to, drive to the range, or they've got their bow tucked away in their closet and that's where they keep it, or they've got to jump through a couple of hoops to get out and shoot it. The easier you can make it to pick up that bow, nock an arrow, draw that bow and shoot it, the more consistent you're going to be. Whether that's setting your bow in a more accessible place, whether that's putting a target, buy a cheap target for your garage, any way you can make that more accessible to start shooting consistently, the better off you're going to be. That leads to the next piece is to put together a really simple plan. Instead of, hey, I'll shoot my bow when I have time to do it, or I guess I'll just shoot a half a dozen arrows because that's the number of arrows I have in my quiver. It helps to set a plan as simple as it could be and say, hey, during my lunch break, I'm going to start shooting a dozen arrows a couple of times per week, or before I leave for work, I'm going to shoot 2 dozen arrows before I leave on Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and that's going to be my plan. But just kind of setting something in place so it's not the thing on the back burner that fills the gap once you get it, right? Because a lot of times we just don't end up doing it. But if we set a plan, make it a priority, and commit to something. That really helps with consistency. And then fourth and final, I would say, is not to jump into shooting distance too quickly, meaning that if you haven't shot for a while and you're just getting back into it, this is a prime time to either establish really good habits and processes, or a prime time to develop bad habits and processes. So there's nothing wrong with 10, 20 yards, getting familiar with that release again, establishing that anchor point, setting a consistent grip each shot, quality over quantity, quality over distance. And when you return to shooting, if you haven't shot for a while, just a really good opportunity to kind of start on the right foot, so to speak, if that makes sense, versus shooting a ton of arrows, shooting at really far distances, because it's exciting to see that arrow trajectory. If you prioritize quality, it can really pay off as archery season comes closer here.
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely agree. I think that 20 good arrows a day is a lot better than 100 decent arrows.
Yeah, I completely agree.
Yeah. So one thing I'd like to talk about is, I know when I'm practicing my hunting bow, I do a couple things different from my target bow. So the target bow, I'm just looking to pound the middle, right? There's no I'm not looking to go quicker in my shot, nothing like that. In my hunting bow, the game is often moving. A lot of times you got a very small window to make that shot. So, I practice making my shot cycle as short as possible. And this is something that I learned from Dad. Dad actually goes from when he bends the string to when the arrow is fired, it's like he can get it down to 3.5, 4 seconds before hunting season, which is insanely quick with a compound bow.
Yeah.
And he can be crazy accurate with it too, just because he practices so much. But one thing I got from that, to be a little bit quicker, is I draw with my pin on target. So I don't do that with target, but when I'm shooting my hunt bow, I like to draw with the pin on target. Now back to what we were talking about earlier with finding a good max draw weight. One thing that I did do last year was I practiced, shooting uphill, downhill, and drawing my bow in those weird angles, especially downhill from the tree stand. And I would put my pin on the target down here, and if I couldn't keep my pin on the target as I drew back, I knew my draw weight was too much. Like standing in the yard, you can raise that bow way up and bring it down, and you can get back more weight. But in my mind, if I can't draw the bow back and keep the pin on target the entire time, that's too much weight for me. Does that sound about? Yeah, does that sound about right?
Yeah. I like that concept, because essentially what you're talking about there is to be able to keep that pin on target when you draw. You cannot allow any contorting or compensation throughout the torso, throughout the shoulder girdle, out into the bow, essentially. So I definitely like that concept. And I don't think it necessarily indicates that you, let me take a step back because my wording's going to be uncertain there. I like, for a similar reason, I like a seated test, right? Where, and not even just seated on a chair, but completely seated on the ground. And I have a video on my YouTube channel, but I like seated on the ground where you're ever so gently seated up against some sort of post. And you're not leaning on the post, but that post is just gently touching and running up and down your spine. Can you draw 100% seated on the ground with that post very gently staying aligned with your spine? And the reason why I like that test is because that post is going to give you feedback, whether you're arching off the post and you're extending and arching through the spine, compensating there for your draw weight. Are you leaning left or right and flexing left to right to be able to compensate for that test? And then the seated on the ground gives you the least mechanical advantage to further make compensation. Now, again, what I was getting at is I don't think that necessarily completely completely ties into, like, if you're in a tree stand for 6 hours cold with heavy clothing, that you're going to be able to draw that bow. But very similar to the concept you just shared, I think both of those are helpful indicators for kind of where you stand as far as margin for error, right? It's kind of the idea that we don't want to be just barely managing that draw weight. We want to have margin for error, gas left in the tank for those less than ideal conditions. So I like where your head's at there for sure.
Yeah, and I really like the what you talked about with the post. And the first thing that comes to mind is maybe I'm helping somebody out who's just beginning archery, teaching them a little bit of form. One of the biggest things I always see is, like, as they draw the bow back, their torso moves so much.
Yeah.
Like, they're always leaning way back, way forward, trying to get it back. And I try to teach them, stand up straight. But I feel like if I had them stand against a post, they'd be able to feel that a little bit better. Which also leads me to the fact of, or I guess the question I have for you, kind of explain to me the importance of, we talked about upper body strength and how that can help with stability and draw weight and stuff like that. But talk about how core strength, lower body strength can improve performance in archery, both, bow hunting and target.
Sure. So we'll start with the target aspect because that's a little bit simpler, where, as you've seen in your training, Mason, and then in the different other programs and people I work with, the core is a big focus as well, because core implies center, right? The core, our core anatomically that we're talking about, is at the center of the whole system, so to speak. And the upper body, the shoulder girdle, the primary working parts for the archer are built on top of that core. So that's where we want to have a core that has sufficient mobility, meaning that the core should be able to move in a variety of ways. It should be able to flex like we'll say bending forward. It should be able to extend like you're arching at the back. It should be able to laterally flex, bend side to side, and it should be able to rotate both clockwise and counterclockwise, and then do all of those movements kind of together. The core can move in such a variety of ways that you're kind of combining those. So we need mobility there, but we also need strength and stability there, where I think I had mentioned it earlier, but I'll paint it a little bit more clearly, that when we think about the human body, the absolute frame of the body, just like the riser of a bow, the frame of the body is our skeleton, our bones. Well, we would fall into a pile of bones if we didn't have connective tissue, muscle tissue to hold it together. And the reason why I mention this is because the core by itself, or I should say the core, if we just take into account the bones, very unstable, can't largely hold itself together hardly at all. That's why, let's say you process a deer and you dump the bones behind the house for the coyotes to benefit from. Eventually, those bones are just going to be a pile of bones because there's no tissue there to hold those bones together anymore. Now, where I'm going with this is that the core musculature is what provides almost all of the stability, bracing, and holding together of the whole system. So when we can strengthen that, stabilize that, then that's where we're able to have that more solid center. We can then build a better functioning upper body on top of that, and ultimately have a solid frame, whether you're a bow hunter or a target archer. Now, this is certainly valuable for target archers because we're after that maximum stability, that maximum bracing, that maximum control of movements and positions, which is going to benefit from that firm center. And target archers benefit from that. But when you talk about bow hunting, there's even further demand placed on that piece, whether it is shooting from a saddle. There's definitely a core component there when you're talking about making shots at different angles. You're not perfectly upright. You're leaning at an angle. So the only thing that's preventing you from folding is core musculature, stability, and bracing and strength there. So that would be one component. And then you could go into a further deep dive if you're talking about hunting mountains, etc. Now, the lower body, some of the concepts I just shared hold true in a similar fashion, just to a lesser extent. Meaning that, yes, foundational strength can be helpful. There is no drawback to being stronger through the lower body and improving function and stability throughout the lower body. All of those are going to be a beneficial thing. But the fact of the matter is if we're talking about standing on a flat surface and drawing a bow, I cannot make a strong case that stronger quadriceps or stronger glutes or things like that are going to have a sizable impact on shooting. They serve as a foundation, but they're not a prime mover. They're not a prime stabilizer in the shot per se. So again, this is people always like to pick and say, yeah, but what here, what there. I will say that there's no cost to stronger, more stable, better functioning lower body, and it can help in some regards, but it's not going to make a massive, huge driver if you're a target archer standing on a flat surface shooting. That's just a matter of fact, and I have not seen any research that says or indicates strongly otherwise. Now, the same thing is true for the bow hunter shooting, but to a little bit of a lesser extent. You do get more lower body involvement if you're starting to talk about shooting from a kneeling position or shooting from a saddle or, climbing tree stands, hiking a mountain, spot and stalk. There's certainly a lot more that goes into being a hunter, so the lower body has huge implications for a hunter and has a little bit more implications just in regard to shooting. Because what's important here, I talked with a father not too long ago for his son. He's a competitive archer, and he asked kind of a similar question. He says, well, do you train the lower body? And I said, if the archer wants to, I definitely address that with probably 50% of my archers, and we train lower body pretty extensively. But I said, as far as shooting proficiency, it's not going to play a huge role. And he said, well, I disagree, because he's got to have a strong, capable lower body to hike 3D courses. And I said, we have to make a separation there. Hiking a 3D course is different from shooting proficiently. Hiking a 3D course is necessary to participate in 3D archery, but the question is do you train lower body for shooting proficiency? And that's where I said, not going to make a huge impact. Now, if we want that person to be capable and fit to hike a 3D course or certainly hike and hunt, then yeah, that's a big deal, but a little bit of a separate requirement, demand, part of the big picture, if that makes sense. So hopefully that adequately answers that question. That's one of those questions that I have to be careful not to give too short or condensed of an answer, because there's a lot of, yeah, but what if, or yeah, what if this?
Absolutely.
So
yeah, that makes total sense. So I know, you talk about hiking a 3D course. I think that being healthy in general it can improve archery in a lot of different ways. Like a great example is hiking a 3D course. If you aren't, physically in shape enough to walk a 3D course without, getting out of breath and stuff like that, then, once you get to that stake and your heart rate's up and you're huffing and puffing, you're going to see, especially throughout the course of the day, shooting 3D, your performance is going to go down. And I've seen that firsthand. Which brings to mind, this past couple weeks, I shot a lot of FIDA style archery. So I shot Joad Nationals, U.S. Open, Buckeye Classic, and they were just blistering hot tournaments. I mean, they were in the 90s and 100s every day, and blistering hot. And you're out there shooting in the sun for 4 or 5 hours, this really long duration of time. And I saw, almost very consistently, a lot of the archers around me would start to taper off. They start to wear out, and they weren't able to maintain themselves. And I think a lot of that can come from food, water as you shoot. But
sure,
I think that general health can even help you a lot in those terms. I know it helped me.
Yes.
Standing out on that field, looking around. I know that since I do the Archery Strong, I do the stuff. I train, I eat right. I felt like I was the healthiest person on the field, and I think that did two things. I think it physically actually helped me, especially in the wind. I know we did a lot of training for the wind shooting, and I definitely saw noticeable differences there. But just health in general, I think that I was able to outlast those guys. Those were the guys out in the heat. But yeah, as far as like noticeable differences in my training so far, core has been one of the biggest ones. We made an emphasis on training core for the wind for these tournaments.
Yeah.
And I saw a huge difference there. I feel like I was able to hold pretty well in the wind compared to some of my competition, which ended up leading me to win both those national competitions, by the way. I don't think I told you yet. But
yeah, that's awesome, man. That's awesome. So, I'm really excited to hear that.
Yeah, great results from that. I know I've recommended Archery Strong to lots of different people since I started doing it. I don't think that there's an archer out there that can't benefit from at least a little bit.
I think so as well.
I know that, given that, the amount of money that I spent on Archery Strong, I think benefited me, 5-10-fold of what that money would have benefited me buying a new sight or something like that. Like,
sure.
That's one thing that I seem to have found over the last couple years, that my money is much better spent on coaches, whether that's form or mental game or physical trainers like yourself for archery, over stuff like equipment and stuff like that. So that's kind of my broad opinion on that.
Yeah, I think that's very wise of you, and that is a tough realization for a lot of people to have, where we kind of touched on the idea earlier that working on ourselves is a lot harder than swiping a credit card, right? Where all I've got to do is swipe that card to get that new sight, or all I've got to do is swipe that card to try a new arrow or a new rest or whatever it might be. And all of those things can be good to help you get the most out of your equipment. But to a certain extent, especially when you're talking about the investment that you're making financially, and then also the amount of return you're going to get from that investment, meaning, a new sight, that you spend $300 on, let's say, maybe a half a percent improvement, let's say, if that's the case, or 1% improvement in your score, versus if you can work with a coach for, let's say, the same amount of money, whether it's form related, mental management related, physically related, and you can get a return of 5-10%. The answer there, or the priority and the focus there, is clear, but again, it's harder, and it takes more effort and work to improve that mental side, improve the form side, improve the physical side, and put in that work and effort. So again, that's very wise on your end, and most archers struggle to do that and have that realization, and a lot of times it takes some grinding and some kind of bashing your head against the wall, so to speak, to finally say, okay, I've been trying to do all these different things with equipment and make different changes, and it's not panning out. It's not giving me the return I'm looking for. Maybe I need to look for the solution in a different area, which is often ourselves.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that, since I've learned good form in archery, got the physical ability, I think that, I'm confident that I could pick up any bow right now and shoot a 300 with it, no matter how poorly that equipment is set up for, hold. I think that holding a pin steady is 90% form and like the strength of the archer, and even a little bit of the mental game too. But I think you're exactly on point, where it's often the archer, not the equipment.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Very well said.
But yeah, so we'll leave it at that, Christian. I think it's been a great podcast. How can people reach out to you or check out some of your videos?
Yeah, thank you, Mason. So everything that I put out as far as information, education, useful tools, I try to provide as beneficial resources as I can be found on primarily Instagram, Facebook, or YouTube, and YouTube. Those are the places where I have all of my, again, content, education, resources, training programs. Well, not training programs. Training programs are best found at my website, which is archerystrong.com. There's also a good way to contact me there. If you would like to contact me, and I welcome people to reach out to me, either reach out to me through the website or via email. Very difficult to keep up with messages on social media. I try to get back to them when I can. The fact of the matter is I've got a wife and children and a life. And I told my wife the other day that if I tried to respond to all the comments and messages and whatnot on social media, I wouldn't be doing anything else. And that's just not the way I'm going to live. So if you want to reach out to me, I welcome you to do that. Email or through the website's best. So those are good avenues of communication.
Yeah, absolutely. Go check it out. Archery Strong, Christian Williams, thanks for coming on today. We'll see you on the next episode.
Thanks, Mason.